Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello and welcome to True Drew Podcast. My name is Avery, and I thought for this introductory episode it would be really fun to just talk about how I got into Nancy Drew and also talk about some of the things that you can expect to hear on this podcast. So my love for Nancy Drew started really young. I actually remember my mom buying me some of the 4-pack sets from Sam's, and I just devoured those books as a kid, and I remember just reading them and loving that Nancy was such a strong female character and that she could do anything. I think another one of the coolest things about Nancy Drew is that she's had so much staying power in just popular culture, and I've talked to people in their 80s and 90s, aunts of mine that remember reading these books as a young girl, and it's so cool. I remember when I read these books, I was like, Nancy is a role model. She, fights off bad guys. She is usually a few steps ahead of the police, and she just solves all these really cool mysteries. It also probably doesn't hurt that Nancy is a redhead. I feel like, and this is debatable, I know, within the community, because sometimes she's depicted as having blonde hair, sometimes Titian hair, and then in some of the later versions, she's said to have red or strawberry blonde hair. And growing up as someone who had that strawberry blonde hair, I saw myself in Nancy, and I thought that was so cool. I felt represented, and I was like, because really, like, redheads, we usually get either orphans, like Annie, Pippi Longstocking, or we are mascots for fast food establishments like Wendy's and McDonald's. So the fact that we got this really cool role model out of this character of Nancy Drew was really neat. So I would say that I was about in the 2nd or 3rd grade when I started reading all these books, and I remember certain ones sticking out to me more than others, like The Secret in the Old Attic. Spoiler alert, the scene where Nancy is trapped up there in the attic and that Black Widow spider has just been like shaken in that jar and just let loose to get her. And I just remember being like so terrified as a kid, but it always impressed me how Nancy could get out of the stickiest of situations. Like, seriously, your girl has dealt with counterfeiters and money launderers and just people who abduct people. It's crazy, just all the varieties of different criminals that Nancy has been up against in these books, and rereading them for this podcast has been one of the most fun things, because I haven't read these books since the last time I picked them up, which was probably when I was 8 or 9 years old. So reading it through the eyes of an adult is oftentimes hilarious, but also still just as inspiring as when I first read them. So I should probably also explain how my love for Nancy Drew got reignited recently. When my dad and I went to an estate sale back in April, and it was down in Alabama, and I had looked at the pictures, and we love to go to estate sales together, and I noticed this whole bookshelf full of Nancy Drew books, and I remember I like audibly gasped, and I was like, we've got to go to this estate sale. And so he and I went on a Saturday, and it was a few hours away, and the whole time I was just like kind of crossing my fingers, like, will the book still be there? And thankfully, even though we took a few pit stops and we stopped to charge his car, all those books were still there. And I remember I was like a bandit. I made out with all those books, and I like stacked them in my arms, and they were like literally, I couldn't see around them as I was trying to go to check out. And so I sat all these books. It was like 70 or 80 books. And I sat them down, and I was like, I know you have like a couple dollars a piece on these, but what would it take to what if I just took these all off your hands? And the guy was like, how about $40? And I was like, you've got a deal. So a lot of these books I didn't even know existed, because as a kid I read the original Yellow Spines up till about 55 or 56. The Mystery of Crocodile Island is the last book that I remembered reading. And so I think most of these are Simon & Schuster or The Minstrel, or Wanderer prints, and they are from the 1980s, 1990s, and so I've never read any of these books, so I'm really excited to experience them for the first time with you all. Also, side note, I really hope you guys can't hear this leaf blower in the background. Although, I feel like it's kind of a nod to the Nancy Drew computer games, because if you could see my setup, I may post like a behind the scenes on my Instagram, which is also a True Drew podcast, if you guys want to follow me there. But I feel like my desk setup is very similar to Nancy's in the computer games, because I've got a desk by the window, and usually in the games you'll see like snow floating by the window or hear a lawnmower in the background. So if you can hear it, I'm sorry, but you know, it kind of feels fitting in a way also. Speaking of the Nancy Drew computer games, I thought it would be cool to kind of outline what you can expect from this podcast. So what I want to do is go through the books in chronological order, because I think it's so cool to see the continuity and also see when certain characters are introduced, and also pick up on errors a little bit easier. So what I'm planning to do is go through the books in order. It's a lot. And then also every 10th episode or so break to talk about either one of the movie adaptations or TV shows or one of the computer games. Because I love the Nancy Drew computer games. So I also want to share with you how I got into those. So the first Nancy Drew computer game that I actually got was Message in a Haunted Mansion. And I remember that day like it was yesterday, because my mom took us to Target and we were doing our usual thing. We were, looking at books and toys and stuff, and we were over there messing with those, the headphones, and you could press all the different like world music, pan flutes and stuff. We were so annoying. My mom was like probably so embarrassed to be with us in the store, but I just happened to look at the computer game aisle and I saw this game by Her Interactive, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's a Nancy Drew computer game. I get to live out what I've read in the books for so long. So I was so excited. I begged my mom for that game and she let me have it, and I took it home, and I just was so fascinated. It was so cool, and it was amazing. It's actually kind of funny because my brothers would play the games with me, and also some of the kids in our neighborhood would come down, and we would just have these big Nancy Drew game parties where we would just try and solve things. And this was back before, it took me a while to figure out that there was like Game Boomers and all these forums where you can look up hints. So we got stuck on so many things because we had no idea. It was the first experience with a Nancy Drew computer game, but it was so fun and spooky, and just, I love the games. I still love them to this day and still play them because it's just fun to be able to solve problems, and just, it's kind of an escape from the real world sometimes. So we will definitely be covering some of the Nancy Drew computer games in this podcast as well, and I plan to kind of go in chronological order with those as well, except for Secret of the Old Clock. I may tackle that one first because it just makes the most sense to discuss it while we're discussing the books, because actually Secret of the Old Clock, the video game, is based on not only the book but also aspects of Hidden Staircase and Mystery at Lilac Inn, and I think one other book. But yeah, I thought it would make the most sense to tackle that one first because it's such a different game compared to the rest, because it's set in the 1930s. Another crazy thing about these books is the fact that they were written in the 1930s, and I don't have any of the originals except for Clue of the Broken Locket. I do have an original copy of that, and I do plan to compare it to the revised in a special episode, but most of the revised books were revised in the late 50s, early 60s, and sometimes into the 70s, so that has been so interesting to me too, is reading them from a modern perspective, because so much has changed culturally with just the things that women were expected to do, the things that women were allowed to do, and it's been so neat. In some ways I love some of the things from back then, but then there's also some things that you read from a modern perspective and you're like, oh, that's a little bit problematic. So we will talk about those things in this podcast too. Another thing that I've kind of picked up on from rereading the first 4 or 5 books is just Hannah Gruen and her cooking. So I thought it would be cool to include a segment on this podcast called What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, and just discuss some of these recipes, these things that she makes, some of them sound okay, and then some of them, quite frankly, sound really disgusting. But it's kind of interesting because it's like, that's what, there's times have changed so much. We don't use gelatin and everything anymore, thank the Lord. But I thought it would be neat to kind of discuss some of the things that Hannah cooks. I also definitely want to rate the covers of these books and the plots, because some of them are so funky and out there plot-wise, but also the covers are so fascinating to me because, Russell Tandy and some of the other artists, there's so many different versions, and I didn't really realize that till recently. And I was at a used bookstore, and I found some of the Nancy Drew books from about the 50s, and Nancy looks completely different, and some of the scenes that they show on the covers of these books aren't even in the books. But I love how they get creative with it and take liberty with it. So yeah, that is kind of a little bit about what you can expect from this podcast. I want to discuss all things Nancy Drew because I'm quite frankly obsessed, and I love it, and I love that this community is so open and so just engaging, and it's so neat to meet people who have the same interests as I do. I also think for this podcast, I'm going to keep to a weekly schedule because reading the books chronologically, there's about 175 of the, original, and then I think they stop at about 2002 or so, and then we branch off into other series, and I do definitely want to read the Nancy Drew files at some point and some of those books from the 80s. But I'm thinking I will release episodes every Thursday, and if you guys haven't already, you can follow us on Instagram at True Drew Podcast. That's where you'll get the latest updates on new episodes and even some teaser content so you can get excited for the next episode. So thank you all for listening to this first episode of True Drew Podcast. On our next episode, we're going to talk about the mystery behind Carolyn Keene and all of the ghostwriters like Mildred Wirt Benson that we can thank for creating Nancy Drew. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. You can follow along on Instagram at True Drew Podcast to see the latest information about new episodes.